Richard. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, let me invite our panelists onto the virtual stage, and I will briefly introduce the four of them. Lisa Curtis is Senior Fellow and Director of CNAS's Indo-Pacific Security Program. She previously served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for South and Central Asia at the NSC until January. Michael Green is Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair at CSIS. He directs Asian Studies at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And he served as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for Asia, with responsibility for East Asia and South Asia. Admiral Harry Harris served as U.S. Ambassador to South Korea from July 2018 to January 2021. That was after 40 years in uniform, which included commands such as U.S. Pacific Command and U.S. Pacific Fleet. And Tanvi Madan is Senior Fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy in the Foreign Policy Program and Director of the India Project at the Brookings Institution. So thanks to the four of you for joining us. You all heard what Kurt had to say, so I won't ask you to, critique any particular thing, but I'll get the questions started. Maybe Lisa can direct the first one to you, and that is this question of the Quad and sort of, there's the deepening of what's possible. There's the broadening to bring in other countries, either formally or an ad hoc basis and things like that. What do you think is the right answer over the near term to what can be done and that can actually kind of move the needle on this balance in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, first, let me say that it's pretty impressive that the Quad has come as far as it has come. I think the Trump administration certainly resurrected the Quad and did a lot of good work, but certainly the Biden administration has taken it to the next level, holding the first ever leader level Quad meeting. But when it comes to the issue of bringing in additional Quad members, I think we have to remember that it's just getting started, right? The Quad is just finding its footing. It's defining its purpose. And so it's a little early to think about bringing in additional Quad members. But that said, I think that it is important for the Quad to be interacting with other like-minded countries, and particularly on an issue-by-issue basis. We saw this in the previous administration when the former Deputy Secretary of State, Steve Biegun, led a series of meetings with the Quad, plus countries like South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam to talk specifically about the COVID crisis shortly after the outbreak of the virus. So I think, we will see interactions between the Quad and other countries, but the question of sort of bringing in new members right now, I think it's a little bit too early. I think the focus is on getting the Quad to operationalize its activities, to show that it can carry through concrete initiatives like this vaccine manufacturing and distribution effort, which was recently announced. And then once the Quad has really learned to operate together and move forward, then perhaps considering expanding it. But right now, I think that's too early.
Tanvi, where do you come down on that? And also, do you see New Delhi as the most reticent of the four members right now? There years ago it was Australia, then it was India, and so what's the view look like for what's possible when you talk to your Indian colleagues?
Well, I give you my view on the expansion question, which I suspect is where India comes down on this as well, which is agreeing with Lisa. Because I think, there is really this question of the Quad being as the pace setting. The pace is set by kind of perhaps the most hesitant member. And in this case, not even because of reasons to do with China, et cetera, just as the country that is not a US ally bringing India into this network, I think, is important. I think there's another aspect, which is in terms of some of the potential members that are often talked about, South Korea, France, etc. There is this question of their view of China. And while, officially everybody says this is not about China, let's be clear, if China wasn't behaving assertively, the Quad would not be where it is today. And the fact that, say, a France or a UK or a South Korea have a very different, I think, view, or not very different, but at least they do have differences in terms of how they see the China challenge and how far they're willing to go to address it. So I think the Quad as is, with what Lisa talked about, which is working together in other formations, whether it's doing a Quad plus exercise with France in the Bay of Bengal, or an anti-submarine warfare exercise with Canada. I think those kind of things are helpful. I will say one thing about kind of where India is in the Quad. I think it was quite striking that you saw India agree to a leaders level summit just around the time that India was negotiating disengagement at one point in the border with China. That's essentially a message to China, partly saying that India is not going to let China veto its participation in the Quad. Admiral Harris will remember a few years ago when he was at PACOM and gave a speech in India just suggesting that the Quad be revived, the reaction was no, no, no. And so we've come a long way. And something Kurt said, this is if China wants to kind of think about what caused the Quad to be where it is, it just needs to look in the mirror.
Harry, if you want to come in on the Quad, then by all means. I also wanted to ask you a question actually I didn't get to with Kurt, which is the state of relations between Seoul and Tokyo, which, have been, I would say, up and down, but more like down and down over the past few years. You just, were in Seoul. What do you think the right American role is there when we have two allies that seem not to get along very well? Oh, you're on mute. Harry, you're on mute.
No, actually, I don't think I am.
Oh, there you go. There you go. Now you're not.
Yeah, I'm good. Let me talk a little to finish up on the Quad, since Tanvi gave me an introduction into that, and then I'll address my opinion of the Japan, Korea, South Korea TIF. So as Tanvi said, I'm a big booster of the Quad. I spoke at the inaugural Raisina Dialogue back in 2016. That's the event that she was referring to, where I advocated for reviving the Quad. I was kind of reviled for doing that in various quarters, but I was a strong believer of the Quad when I was in uniform, and I remain so now. As to the question of the numbers, I've used the analogy of American college football, right? The Big Ten Conference has 14 teams. The Big 12 Conference has 10 teams. So there's nothing that says the Quad has to have 4 teams. Regarding whether the time is right to invite new members to the Quad, I align myself with Lisa's and Tommy's comments on that. One, there's no gatekeeper to the Quad, so who's to say yes or no? But I do think that the leaders' statement, the remarkable statement that the 4 leaders made about the Quad, sort of defines who should be members of the Quad, right? And they talked about democratic nations dedicated to delivering results through practical cooperation. So that's 3 things there. Democratic nations dedicated to delivering results, that's action-oriented, through practical cooperation. That means that 4 members of the Quad and other members that would join potentially should cooperate and get along well with all the other members, right? That's what practical cooperation means. And that sort of is a segue into the question of Japan and Korea. So they are not aligned, as you say. Sometimes it's up and down, but now it's more down and down. And I think that's a pretty accurate depiction. Though I think with the change in administration in Japan, with Prime Minister Suga now taking the helm there, and they have had positive and a lot of outreach across that body of water whose name we can't mention because even that is political, right? between Seoul and Tokyo. I do believe that there is no important issue in East Asia that can be resolved. I believe there's no issue that can be resolved without the cooperation of both Seoul and Tokyo. And so the United States finds ourselves in this difficult position between two very strong allies of us. So we are allied with South Korea and we are allied with Japan. But we can't be seen as taking sides in the dispute between Seoul and Tokyo. It's not right. But I do believe we have an interlocutor role. We have to play that role. I think we're playing it now. I think we're playing it now better than we played it in the previous administration. It's a critical role, and there is work to be done in order to get our two main allies in the region to be thinking about how to tackle problems together, problems that would not be resolved otherwise were they unable to see eye to eye on a way forward.
Great. Mike, let me turn to you and if there's anything you want to add to those questions, but I also wanted to ask you about the administration's at least stated focus on promoting democratic values in the Indo-Pacific as a more prominent element of American foreign policy. And of course, what that looks like in practice is hard to say sometimes. And we also hear from time to time, even some of our friends in places like Australia or Japan, like, hey, don't overdo the democracy stuff. Like, make sure that you're working with Vietnam and all these other countries. So what do you think is sort of the right approach to squaring that circle of wanting to be able to work with like-minded autocracies, but also promote the values that we think are so important? You are on mute, Mike.
Yeah, we're not putting ourselves on mute, but I'm free now. Thank you, Richard. Congrats on the 15th annual conference, by the way. I was in the first one, and I'm delighted to be here for the 15th and what I'm sure is only the beginning of many more. Quickly on the Quad, it's worth remembering the genesis of this idea. It goes way back. Commodore Matthew Perry came back from opening Japan and said that in the future we will have to safeguard the Pacific and the sea lanes against hegemonic aspirants on the continent. He had in mind China and Russia, and interestingly also India. But he argued that there's something about maritime powers and democracies. And his vision was the US, Great Britain, Japan, substitute the Royal Australian Navy and the Indian Navy for Britain, and you have the Quad. And the Brits are, sort of knocking at the door again. But the other more recent genesis, of course, was after the tsunami in 2004, when the US, Japan, Australia, and India, in about 14 hours, I was a senior Asia official in the White House at the time at the NSC. In about 14 hours, we put together a task force to provide relief across the entire Indian Ocean. It was remarkable. It happened in the US between Christmas and New Year's, so most of the US government wasn't here. And so we were very efficient until everyone came home from vacation, and then it slowed down. But the Quad was created to provide public goods, to help people in need in Asia, to show that the maritime democracies had that in our, not only the capabilities, but in our political and strategic culture. And it was an open architecture. And very quickly, Indonesia and Thailand, of course, but the UN and eventually even China sent a medical mobile, a MASH hospital to Aceh. Everyone was better by then. They were very late. But even China eventually joined in. And I think that model for the Quad is the right one. Keep the four deep in, as Kurt said, but have a la carte participation in any way countries want to, even notionally including China at some point, I would say, if it's the right issue set. On democracy. So I went to SAIS just a little before you, Richard. But when I was going to SAIS, I was taught in the mid 80s that realists don't worry about democracy in foreign policy strategy. It was idealists who did that. It was Wilsonian idealists. Realists focus on power. And I was also taught in Asian studies that Asians like a collective authoritarian system. that was sort of the norm, frankly, among a lot of scholars. You and I, more me than you, have studied under, because most of them were retired by the time you came. And then in the next few years, you had democracy everywhere. Taiwan, Korea, of course, Indonesia, Japan had its own sort of quiet democratic revolution. So Asia is a story of evolutionary progress on democracy. It's a good story on the whole, despite recent setbacks. And I think the key is not to think of it as a rock in the rucksack. It's something we kind of have to do because of Congress, but as something that is fundamental to our foreign policy strategy. In part because of our own values, in part because our support for democracy is a signal to other democratic allies that we have their back, in part because if governments are accountable to their people, we will find that their markets are more open, their intellectual property rights are better protected. We'll find that they will be less likely to be bribed or coerced into Belt and Road projects that aren't good for them. So to have a level playing field, if you will, to make sure countries are resilient and open to our business and free from coercion, this should be mainstreamed in our foreign policy strategy everywhere in Asia. But it cannot be a blueprint from Washington that is then sent to posts, like a fatwa. It has got to be developed with multiple approaches. We have a project at CSIS where we're regularly updating and looking at Indonesian approaches, Korean approaches, Indian approaches. We've got to have a multipolar approach to democracy, just like we do with the Quad and with the free and open Indo-Pacific. We're too used to, frankly, designing it in Washington and then sort of getting frustrated when people don't do it exactly the way we do it.
Great. Actually, that leads into a question I wanted to pose to Tanvi. So, India is the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific, and there's been probably the biggest long-term bet in U.S. foreign policy from the final year of the Clinton administration through today of presidents of both stripes is to invest in this relationship, believing that a stronger India is good for the United States and a stronger India closer to the United States is good for the United States. Part of that was this whole, we're a great democracy, they're a great democracy, the world's oldest and the world's biggest sort of cliche. And with some of the worries about, kind of creeping illiberalism in India and things like that, I mean, do you think that poses a threat to the value of India as seen in Washington from the strategic level? Or is that just the kind of thing where ultimately policymakers just say, hey, well, we have our differences on that issue, but, we still want to progress along this path that we've been on?
Well, I think the way you've seen the Biden administration kind of approach it is from kind of a pragmatic perspective, which is to say, this is a country that is on the strategic side, on the economic side, and on the values side important. And the way to perhaps kind of nudge it or shape its decisions, whether at home or abroad, is to engage with it. And I think and obviously they do have some concerns, some that even in fact impact kind of commercial operations, for example, of American social media companies potentially. So I do think, they have concerns, but they have made a decision that it is important. And I think it's also a reflection of the fact that at the end of the day, there's a recognition that India's problems in this front will be solved in India. Having said that, I think where India needs to think about this is that one of the strengths of the US-India relationship has been the fact that it has had so many constituencies, and not just in the administration, but on the Hill, across parties, across generations, as well as with the private sector, with civil society. And it has been to India's benefit that so many constituencies have all pulled in the same direction, which is towards a closer relationship with India. And many of these constituencies do care about these liberal values. And so to say that, this is our business and nobody should care about it is also unrealistic. These things will matter. And after all, it is India that often holds its democracy up as a reason sometimes for the US to make exceptions for it. And I do think if these questions and concerns continue, it does become harder for administrations, not that they won't necessarily pull in the same direction, but I think the base perhaps of the trajectory might remain the same, the pace will perhaps be affected. It also could affect the administration's ability, particularly working with partners on the Hill, to try to do things for India, whether it is to make efforts for various policies or even make exceptions for India. And there have been various exceptions that have been made. So I do think, this factor will matter. I think, speaking to kind of Mike's point, though, this also does raise a question about there will be trade-offs that the administration will need to make. They won't be easy, but they will have to be made sometimes on these kind of, do you prioritize, kind of the strategic imperatives or the values imperatives? And sometimes you see administrations say, oh, there isn't a trade-off. But, one thing the Cold War taught us is that that's easier said than done.
If you are in these meetings, then you get to raise things in priority order and you have trade-offs. But Lisa, just on that question, and come in on these other ones if you'd like, but on that question, so Tanvi, it sounds absolutely right to me that the pace and some of the exceptions made for India are related to the fact that it's a great big democratic power. But that is different, of course, than saying that if US officials raise these issues with their colleagues, even privately, then that will help the situation rather than hurt the situation because of the natural disinclination to listen to Americans telling you how to conduct your domestic affairs. But you've been to some of these meetings. I mean, how do you see this work out or not at a practical level?
Yeah, well, I think promoting democracy is more of an art than a science. And I agree with Mike that you have to tailor your approach to the individual countries. Look, I think it's very important for the US to stand up for democracy and to have a values-based foreign policy. I think that is important. But at the same time, we have to balance that with being practical and seeing how we can make real forward progress rather than maybe sanctioning an individual, but then losing overall leverage with the country. It has to be more of a holistic approach to how we're encouraging democracy. And I think with regard to China, what's more important is showing that we support countries' independence and their sovereignty and their ability to not be pressured by Chinese economic, political, or military coercion. So I think that's important. With regard to India, I think this is a difficult issue. But again, no democracy is perfect, not even ours, frankly. And so I think that we, again, need to approach it holistically. We need to continue to stand up for democratic, liberal values. That's what's expected of the United States. But at the same time, we have to not think that we can dictate what's happening inside of a country, and that each country has its own dynamic. So again, it's a difficult balance. And I'll point out when President Trump was in India, as you'll recall, there were terrible violence, dozens of Muslims killed in Hindu-Muslim violence, not very far from New Delhi, where President Trump actually was. It was a devastating situation. President Trump did not strongly condemn the violence and what was happening. But I do know that in his meeting with Prime Minister Modi, he did raise the issue of religious freedom. So I do think there is something to be said for, raising issues privately, and being able to have more impact if you're sort of respectful for the leadership of the country, and just being careful in how you raise it. So it's a balance. You don't check your democratic values at the door, but you also don't go on a crusade where you're trying to spread democracy in every place in every way. So that's my response.
For folks in the audience, we're going to go till 3:30. So if you have questions, stick some in the chat box and we'll try to get to them. I wanted to go to to Mike and then to Harry on another issue that I didn't get to ask Kurt about, and that's North Korea, which is sort of amazing that it didn't even make the conversation with the top Asian official, because had we turned back the clock, a couple of years, it would have been potentially issues 1, 2, and 3, given how, certainly the diplomacy, but then the near, or the talk of war, at least during the Trump administration. And so if you sort of look into your crystal ball, the North Koreans have a way of elbowing their way back onto our agenda. So I think it's probably a matter of time before we see something that they try to do to shake up the situation. But do you think a return to, fire and fury is sort of what's in order here, or a return to, I don't know, could, nice guy Joe Biden get a summit success where, tougher guy Donald Trump didn't or something? Or is this one of these problems you just have to manage, not going to go away, don't pay too much attention, don't let it draw you away from the bigger challenge of China? So how do you see how the North Korea thing fits into the right administration approach of the region as a whole? So let me go to Mike and then to Harry on that.
So as you know, the Biden administration has finished its North Korea policy review and is announcing that it's not going to do the strategic patience of the Obama administration, and it's not going to do the Hail Mary, big summit, big threats of war of the Trump administration, to which a lot of us who were in the Bush administration said, oh, you mean the Biden administration is going to do what the Bush administration did, particularly towards the latter years where we tried some incremental deals. And frankly, that sounds about right. Doing nothing's not an option, but I think cashing in presidential prestige or diplomatic relations in pursuit of an unlikely deal is a mistake. So that's probably the right pragmatic approach. There is an unfortunate tendency for nobody who worked at our levels, but for principals in the U.S. government to want to put North Korea in a box, just kind of keep it there, and then focus on bigger problems in Asia. And that's always a mistake. Number one, because the geopolitics affect our leverage with North Korea. If Harry Harris can fix the US, Japan, Korea trilateral problem, then we will have much more leverage with Beijing and therefore with North Korea. So we got the connection right now between the North Korea diplomacy and geopolitics. But the really important connection will come at the point of regime change, frankly, unification. And remember, the Korean War is frozen by an armistice. In some ways, the Cold War is frozen on the Korean Peninsula. And when it unfreezes with questions of unification, if Beijing demands no U.S. alliance for a unified Korea, no U.S. presence, if even PLA forces intervene in some way, that will be the most important and significant deflection point in the history of Asia. In the 21st century would be huge. So we need to be thinking about Korea, talking to everyone, especially our allies. Big mistake, I think, to kind of keep it in a box and not think about it.
Harry?
I was very pleased with this notion that, as announced through their policy review. And if Kurt were here, I'd give him a shout out for his phrase, the solutions-based approach with North Korea. I think that's very important. I'm pleased that also that it appears we're going to pick up with Singapore from where Singapore left off, the Singapore summit back in June of 2018. Rather than to start from the beginning, like a lot of administrations do, and then you spend half to 3/4 of the administration getting to the point where you're having some kind of a meaningful dialogue, and then the administration ends, and then the next one starts over. And so, the idea of picking up where Singapore left off and acknowledging the good work of Steve Biegun on the U.S. side and Lee Do-hoon on the South Korean side, I think that's important and it's helpful. It's also important that we, be honest with ourselves in asking and answering the question, what does Kim Jong-un want? And I believe that he wants 4 things. I think he wants sanctions relief. He wants to keep his nukes, and so that's the biggest challenge, right? How do you have a dialogue? How do you move forward how do you convince him to give up his nukes? And the idea that Singapore had was, if you do all these things, and then you can indeed have a brighter future for your people. Speaking to KJU. So, but back to the question: what does KJU want? He wants sanctions relief. He wants to keep his nukes. I believe he does want to split the U.S. ROK alliance to ultimately to dominate the peninsula with him in charge, or his party, his family in charge. So that's a pretty harsh view, but I think that history has validated that view, not only with Kim Jong-un's recent history, but his father and grandfather's history. So if we approach North Korea with that understanding and not make hope a course of action, then I think we're probably in a good place. I do believe that pressure alone is insufficient. We have to be open to diplomacy. Diplomacy matters here as it matters everywhere. And I think Bruce Klinger has it about right. He said that the biggest impediment to improve relations with North Korea is Kim Jong-un. And so, all the rhetoric in the past, 6 to 8 months has not been helpful. The lack of any engagement, despite what the media has reported has been extensive outreach by the Biden team, has not been helpful. So I think that, but you can't want it more than they want it. They being North Korea. So we've got to continue to be open to overtures and be open to diplomacy. South Korea gets a vote here, a big vote, but I think it's important that we not trade things like sanctions or things like joint exercises. We not trade those things away simply for the hope of bringing North Korea to the table, the negotiating table. If you're going to have a negotiation and give up and relieve some sanctions or cancel some exercises, if those are the outcomes of negotiations, that's all good. That's why you have negotiations. But you shouldn't give these things away before you have negotiations. I mean, that's Einstein's definition of insanity, right? Try the same experiment over and over again and hope for a different outcome. So that's where I am on that issue.
All right, great. Let me go to a question from Hiroki in the audience. Is it possible for the United States to facilitate cooperative security with China on maritime security issues, joint exercises and training among law enforcement agencies, Coast Guard, navies, gray zone, escalation, crisis management, confidence, security building measures? Anyone want to take up what might be possible in the way of cooperative security with China, or is that just a non-starter given where we are?
Well, I'll start, and then I'll defer to anybody else since we do exercises. We've partnered well with China on a number of important fronts over the years, including North Korea. I mean, the sanctions regime, as tough as it is, would not exist without China's active approval and involvement in it, because it's a UN decision. So they get a vote. As a matter of fact, they get a veto. So, we have partnered well with China, but we fundamentally disagree with China on a number of issues, which have been discussed already. I won't rehash them. We had military exchanges with China at RIMPAC, the Rim of the Pacific exercise, when I was a Pacific Fleet commander. And I think rightly so, we canceled China's participation in RIMPACs as I was leaving PACOM because, that's RIMPAC is a show of cooperative engagement, cooperative security, learn from each other, and that kind of thing. And China's behavior just belies that. And then you have the issue of Taiwan. As Kurt said, we have the law, the Taiwan Relations Act. We have obligations to Taiwan under the law. And I think it's important that we fulfill those obligations, those legally mandated obligations to the fullest extent.
I was just going to say that the real convening center for multilateral maritime cooperation right now that includes China is the ADMM Plus. It's an ASEAN-centered set of military, especially naval exercises. That's probably a more likely route than a U.S.-China route right now, given what Harry just said. And we also have to remember that the fundamental obstacle to confidence building or other forms of maritime security exchange with China is that the PLA still has a fundamental belief that transparency is strategically a bad idea for them, that they need to conceal their weaknesses from us. And also, you know, Admiral Harris says, I've also been involved in negotiations with Beijing on military confidence building measures. They always insist that we acknowledge their 9-dash claim, that we stop our surveillance. And they have a long list of demands before you even get in the room to talk about these things. So there's a lot of obstacles on the Chinese side. But there are things happening. And maybe Coast Guard's a good idea for the next, but maybe look a bit more to ASEAN, actually, for that purpose.
And you said no to all those demands, Mike? You didn't acknowledge the 9-dash line or any of that?
When I was in OSC, I said yes to everything. And then Captain Harris came over from the Joint Staff and shut off my microphone.
slapped it down.
No, it was very frustrating if you've been in those talks.
Yeah.
First principles.
Lisa, let me go to you and zoom kind of back out to the big Indo-Pacific policy of the Trump administration and then the Biden administration, and obviously the dominant role that China plays in this. I think for a lot of observers, it's sort of surprising how much continuity there has been at the level, at least of sort of strategic direction, even though if there are differences on the tactics of how to deal with China, it's been sort of a tougher policy than a lot of people expected with China in the current administration. The tariffs that I would guess this administration would not have put on China had it been in power haven't come off, and they've left those and things like that. So, you had this, you were in the driver's seat for the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific policy. So, what are the lessons learned there? And are you surprised that it seems, at least from the outset, that more has been retained perhaps and discarded?
Yeah, I'm personally surprised at the continuity of the policy. It's been quite remarkable, actually. But of course, there is one difference. And if we're talking about lessons learned, well, first, let me talk about some of the positive things or the successes that I think the previous administration had with regard to the Indo-Pacific. First, we had the Indo-Pacific Strategic Framework, which President Trump signed off on back in February 2018. This, of course, was released to the public shortly before Trump left power. And I think if you go back and you look at the strategy that the previous administration had followed from 2018 to 2021, it largely holds up. And I think you see similar policies being pursued by this administration. And so I think that was a good interagency whole of government approach to the China challenge. And, hopefully we'll see an NSC-led process similar to that from this administration. I think it's helpful to have the NSC leading the strategy so that the implementing agencies can all sort of fall behind and we have a coordinated strategy. I would hate to see a different strategy coming out of DOD and state. I really hope that they have an NSC-led strategy. And I think that's a good thing that the Trump administration had early on in the administration. Second was what happened with the Quad. As I mentioned before, the Quad was resurrected. And I think this is a big accomplishment of the previous administration. And then third, I would point to the elevation of the India relationship. We saw the establishment of the 2+2 framework for dialogue. We had 3 2+2 meetings in 2018, 2019, and 2020. That was quite significant. And especially in the last year of the Trump administration, there was a lot of progress in the U.S.-India relationship. Now, some of that was because of the pandemic. We saw the interdependencies between the US and Indian economies, our reliance on pharmaceuticals from India, and also the importance of transparency. When we saw the lack of transparency from China, I think it really emphasized the importance of India's voice at international fora. So we're very happy that India is part of the UN Security Council, will be for the next 2 years, and they bring a very important voice to the global issues. And that really became apparent following the pandemic. And then, of course, the India-China border crisis, the U.S. showed itself as a reliable partner to India, providing needed military gear, moral support, intelligence, information sharing. So I think those are some of the very positive things. In terms of lessons learned or things that I hoped would have gone differently with regard to the Indo-Pacific is, and I think we will see a change from the Biden administration, is more cooperation with Europe. There should have been more consultation, cooperation. Europe, shares U.S. values, and I think that we could have made much more progress in terms of dealing with a rising China had there been greater respect for those commonalities that we share with Europe. So I think that was probably the major thing that was lost in the previous administration, but we're seeing actually this week that situation being turned around with President Biden's visit to Europe, meeting with the G7, the UK, the EU, NATO. I think we're really going to see, a different story developing with regard to our relationship with Europe, how we address challenges, particularly coming from China. And it's not only America being back. I know that's been the phrase. It's democracy coming back. That binding value that we share, which is increasingly important as we're trying to make sure that the order is a liberal order that we see going forward, not an authoritarian order. So I think that's what I saw from my viewpoint.
Great. Tanvi, let me give you the last question. And I'm curious what you think the lessons that Indian strategic planners and decision makers are taking away from the border crisis, and therefore how U.S. policymakers might see India setting its own strategic direction. So, given what happened, is India likely to change its military modernization plans, its war doctrine plans, like to discern an interest in Taiwanese security, the South China Sea? Or is this actually focused on more on the border, or kind of what's the fallout from that with respect to India as a strategic and military partner?
So I think it's still playing out, but I do think, and I know there's some debate on this, that both the boundary crisis, which is still ongoing, and it has been different than the last few China-India boundary crises we've seen, but also what Lisa talked about, which is China's handling of COVID. This does represent an inflection point for how India sees China. I think it's dented a few kind of assessments or arguments that Indian policymakers, or at least seem to make, which is that, and they have thought China is a challenge since and planned to kind of had war plans for it since the 60s, but even saw it as a challenge before that since the 50s, and therefore much more consistently than any of the other Quad countries, for example. But they have thought they had time to tackle it. And that, they had a certain amount of deterrence involving a mix of engaging China, managing the boundary dispute through a set of agreements, but also a careful kind of combination of building capabilities, I would say, and partnerships. There was just enough, but not too much to provoke China or impinge on kind of Indian defense spending or kind of where India spent money, the guns versus butter debates, or it didn't impinge on its foreign policy preferences. So, partnership with the US, but not too close. I think there was also an assessment that economic engagement with China could alleviate political strains, much as it was the same assessment that was made here, and also that you could keep the boundary disputes separate from the broader relationship. And I would say each of those assessments, there's been some rethinking in the Indian government. I do think you've already seen changes in policy, domestic policy. Particularly, it has tipped the scale in terms of some internal debates on, for example, whether to allow Huawei into, the 5G network, the nature. But it's also made a difference in terms of things that India might not have agreed to do with the U.S. If you had asked me 5-7 years ago, or 5 years ago, if we'd have been seen in the middle of a China-India crisis, a U.S. maritime reconnaissance aircraft refuel on the Andamans, I would have kind of looked at you strange, but we saw that happen, not to mention an in-person 2+2, a Quad Foreign Minister Summit, all in the middle of a China-India crisis. So I do think it's made a difference. I think in terms of the kind of military modernization, et cetera, just very quickly, I do think you've seen some changes in thinking about needing to implement the reforms that the military has talked about, modernization. But this is coming at a time and coinciding at a time of this health and economic crises that will also need a lot of those resources. So I think, India will have to find creative ways of doing both. But I think this also means that it is going to have to double down on partnerships that will help it mitigate that capabilities gap that it has with China. But I think you've seen rethinking across the board, including on not necessarily that India will get involved in a Taiwan contingency, but that it will not be left unaffected by it, and we'll have to think about it more systematically. Just finally, one thing on Taiwan, you've really seen in 2020 the visibility of Taiwan amongst the Indian public grow significantly, and support for it in a way that I do not think you would have seen without China's handling of COVID or the boundary crisis.
Great. Thank you. Tanvi, Lisa, Mike, Harry, thank you for a great discussion. Really grateful for the time that you took to be with us today and for all of your thoughts and insights. This was fantastic. We are now ending the first day of our virtual conference. This will pick up where we left off on Thursday, June 10th. We'll have a session called Protecting Democracy, Protecting National Security. That's going to kick off at 11 a.m. Conference.cnas.org has got all the information. So please tune in if you are interested in any of that, and there will be more to come after that. In the meantime, to our panelists, thank you again, and everybody who tuned in, thank you, and we will see you on Thursday.